So yeah, hello everyone. Next lecture in the cycle of the Digital Humanities lunch series. And you know, the names that we have here in this lunches are bigger and bigger and bigger. And today we are hosting Professor Jonathan Hope from the University of Strathclyde. I'm not sure about the pronunciation of the place, but
Strathclyde.
Yeah, that's yeah, and actually we haven't met in person for years, but our paths crossed many times. I remember you in, was it Boston or New York? One of the Renaissance Society of New York. Yeah. And Professor Hope was giving a keynote speech in front of 3,000 people. He was doing very well, and I was impressed. I was impressed with this. So yeah, and Professor Hope is a specialist in Shakespeare, in early modern literature, and linguistics. And as he says on his webpage, his teaching and research focus on the intersection of language and literature, uses techniques from linguistics to explore literary texts and literary texts as evidence for the linguistic history of English. And this combination, sometimes called literary linguistics, has a long history at Strathclyde. And Professor Hope is also the author of a few seminal books in Shakespeare and the language of Shakespeare. And today he will discuss Sequent, new tools and methods for lexical inquiry. So the floor is yours. Thank you very much for coming.
Thank you. Thanks for inviting me. Okay, so this is it's kind of obviously very carefully planned and written, but also quite informal. And I'm going to talk about various tools that I've been involved in using and in some cases developing. I've got slides for everything just in case there's a problem, but I've also got a live link and we can go to the actual tools and do some live searches if the mood takes us. So if you have, once I get on to talking about specific words, if you have any favorite words that you want to see, search for, just let me know and we can do that. There's kind of two halves to the talk. I'm going to start talking about looking at texts at a very big scale, so looking across tens of thousands of texts at the same time. And then in the second half, which is kind of what the Sequent in the title refers to, I'm going to show how you can use those tools that are developed to look across huge amounts of text at the same time to follow individual words through, in this case, early modern print culture. But could be any kind of culture. But I think it's one of the things I'm getting very interested in is the way that the new tools that are becoming available in my period, but also in other periods, allow us to look at the way that instead of fixating on authors perhaps in the way that we have tended to in the past, we can now look at words and actually trace words through culture. And one of the things I'll be talking about tomorrow in my plenary is the way we can use these tools to debunk myths about Shakespeare as a creator of words. He didn't make up words. I haven't found any that he made up yet. And you can use the new tools that are coming out to actually show that all of the claims for words that Shakespeare made up, people were using those words 10, 20, 50, 70 years before he was. But that's boring, that's not very interesting. So I'm not going to talk about that to you because it's a kind of high level group. So I'm going to talk about what I think are actually more interesting kind of cultural level things you could do with this stuff. But I'm going to begin with a project that I'm not involved with at all, but this is a project, everything I'm going to say in this talk kind of is based on this material. This is the TCP, the Text Creation Partnership. Can I get a sense of how many people have heard of it? Couple. Okay. The Text Creation Partnership is a group of largely American and British, but some other universities who got together and basically put money into a big pot to pay for the transcription of kind of effectively every printed text from about 1450 to 1700 in English. They put money in, and texts were transcribed. If anyone's ever used early English books online, which is a set of page images of those texts, that's what it is. It's basically a transcribed version of the page images that allow you to access pretty much any early modern text. It's an incredibly important project. It's come to an end now. One of the many fantastic things about it is that the texts are all going to be released entirely free. So anyone at the moment can download about half of them and have them on a hard drive and do anything they want with them. Eventually, the other half are going to be released probably in about 4 or 5 years. So in terms of putting data into people's hands, it's a fantastic project, just on the basis of making it freely available. But it's incredibly culturally important because it allows us to look at early modern print culture in the round, as it were. So here's what it's done. This is a photograph of the vault at the Folger Shakespeare Library in Washington, DC, where I do a lot of my research, although I never actually call up any of these books. Whenever I go, they all say, "Oh, what books would you like to save?" I don't care about your stupid books. I've got them all on my computer. I don't need to read them. But there they are. There's a kind of very small number of the top number of books that the Folger has. One of the biggest libraries of early modern English books in the world. I think it's the second largest after the British Library and the Bodleian, maybe. So if you go to the Folger, they will let you read most of those books. But now they've all been digitized, now they've all been put into, effectively made into text files. Of course, you can do something else. Here's another view of all of those books. And that actually is all of the books. That is 60,000 EBO TCP files, converted into text files, tagged with a tagger that my project has that I'll talk a bit about in a moment, and then visualized, in this case, using principal components analysis. But basically, this is something I did just at a weekend, just because I could, because I wanted to make a pretty picture. And there you are, you see it's a pretty picture. I like to think of it as a heart. It's kind of the beating heart of early modern culture. Very nice picture. Unfortunately, totally meaningless. And tells you nothing whatsoever about early modern culture. The reason for that is we don't really have metadata for the texts. The TCP files come with a very kind of bare level of metadata. You get an author, which might or might not be right. You get a date, which might or might not be right. There's a title, but the title is simply a transcription of whatever appears on the title page of the book. And if anyone's ever worked with early modern text, you'll know that the title pages tend to be very, very long. And the titles on the actual printed book very often bear virtually no relationship to the titles that we use for these texts. So if you try to search for a text using a title that you know, you are likely not going to find anything. If you search the TCP files for Hamlet, you will not find Hamlet, because it does not appear on the title page of text. No, not the text we know of as Hamlet. So it's, on the one hand, it's great to have all of these files available. Fantastic service done to the academic community. On the other hand, at the moment, those files are pretty intractable. It's very hard to do anything useful with them in the state that they are now. So, a lot of people are producing software and tools and methods that will allow you to get at these files in some kind of more sensible way, allow you to actually manipulate them and work with them in some way. And I've been involved with a pretty large project funded by the Mellon Foundation in the States, between Madison, Wisconsin University, my university Strathclyde, and the Folger Shakespeare Library. And what we've been doing is kind of two things. One is producing subcorpora from the EBO TCP files, so actually tidying up the files, putting them into a kind of separate, sensible groups so that people could actually do stuff with them. And I'll just show you some of the things we've done. So I'll just go. So here's the live page, and you can see we've got a whole lot of things at the top. One of the things we have, pull down menu. These are the corpora that we've constructed. A lot of people who work in the early modern period are very interested in drama because it's a period of Shakespeare. So we've got an early modern drama collection where we pulled out all of the texts that we thought were dramatic texts from the 60,000 TCP files. Not a very easy job to do. Took a lot of work. We pulled them out, we processed those texts to make them more usable. We've done a lot of work on the metadata, so these texts have very, very good metadata in terms of dates and authorship. And you can actually do interesting stuff with them. We've also got an early modern science collection, so we pulled out every text that we think is scientific or medical from the 60,000 TCP texts. And then we've also got, well, you can download the TCP, the free TCP text, so there's about 25,000 of them that you can download from us. And they're, again, quite reasonably tidied up. Not to the same standard as the drama and science. But you can also get this collection, which is the one I'm going to talk about a bit, which is called the Early Modern 1080. And the Early Modern 1080 is an attempt to get beyond that black heart of nothingness that I showed you. What this is it's a kind of representative sample, kind of randomly, not entirely randomly, but in that sense of random that people like to use when they're trying to be scientifically correct, kind of randomly selected. We selected 40 texts from every decade of the TCP collection. So the idea is that it kind of represents the whole thing, and it consists of 1,080 texts. And that's a kind of manageable enough number that we actually had some of our research assistants go through those texts and put each one into a generic category. So in other words, we've got quite good metadata for these texts, so we can now try to model the whole of the EBO TCP unit. So let's go back to, oh actually I'll just, one of the other things that we've got, and I'll probably talk a bit more about this tomorrow in the round table. This is a text tagger. It's designed to work with the EBO TCP text, but it actually works with any text. So those of you who are not interested in early modern literature and think, oh God, I've got to sit here while he talks about early modern literature for an hour. This would actually be useful to anyone who's got text that they want to process and tag in some way. What it allows you to do is you upload your text in a zip file, preferably plain text format, but it doesn't actually matter. It'll have a go at tagging anything. As a default, it tags with a piece of software known as DocuScope, which I've done a lot of work with, was developed at Carnegie Mellon University for the kind of rhetorical analysis of genres. And it looks for strings and puts them into certain rhetorical categories, and then you can classify texts on the basis. But you don't need to use DocuScope. One of the most useful things about this tagger is that you can write your own rules file, and it will search for whatever you tell it to search for. It has to be a string, but basically, as long as you can characterize what you want as a string, you can then include a bunch of strings in an overall rule if you want. It's just 2 columns in a spreadsheet. It's I've done it. It's very, very easy to do. And it's actually quite handy, even if you just check looking for a couple of words across a lot of texts. You can write the rule file in about two minutes, upload your text, and get tagged text back. So it's actually probably one of the most useful things that we produced on the project, I think. So I kind of invite you to play around with that if you've got text that you want tagging. Let's go back to okay, so I've introduced you to visualizing English print. I talked about the early modern 1080 corpus, which is this attempt to produce something that makes sense of the 60,000 texts, which at the moment we don't know enough about to be able to make sense of. If you go onto our corpus page, you can actually download pre-tagged versions of those texts, and you get the CSV file, the spreadsheet, which has got all of the frequencies of the docuscope categories as well. So you don't even need to bother tagging the text, you can just put that straight into a statistical analysis program and start producing pretty pictures. Talked about ubiquity. If you do that with a 1080, and you ask your statistical software to color the texts by genre, you get something like this. Okay, so this is a kind of stripped down version of that black heart that we looked at earlier, except now we know something about the texts. They're color coded according to genres, and we'll look at what some of those genres are at the moment. What you should be able to see, I think you can, just looking at those colors, that actually the genres are clumping. They're not just spread out all over the space, they're actually occupying particular areas of PCA space there. So we got good evidence for genres being, surprise, surprise, genres being linguistically similar to each other. Okay, that's quite nice, but it's a bit confusing. It's not very easy to see what genres are where. So I've gone through and highlighted particular genres in different analyses. And hello. It's the future corner. Yeah. Okay, and this is a very, we've only just started playing around with this kind of thing, but it's quite, in some respects, quite exciting. Because we're kind of looking at a reasonable representation of the whole of early modern print culture. And once you start dividing it up by genres, you start to be able to say things about the whole of early modern culture. Now, if you look at these genres, we've got augmentation on the left, medicine on the left, non-fictional prose on the left, religious prose on the left. And then you look at the genres over here, we've got fictional prose shifted over to the right, very clear distinction between non-fiction and fictional prose. Drama, very clearly on the right again. Elegy on the right, religious poetry on the right. So just immediately you can start to say there seems to be quite a big...
Are the images for fictional prose and drama, they seem to be identical?
Sorry?
The images for fictional prose and drama seem to be identical.
Oh, well spotted there. That's my mistake, sorry. Whichever one of those is wrong, if I put the right one in, the dots would be more or less there. Sorry about that, but thank you for pointing that out. So one of the things we're starting to see is, one of the things that seems to be structuring linguistic variation between these, in this case 10,080 texts, but mapping onto the 60,000 texts, is a kind of fundamental distinction between fiction on the one hand and non-fiction on the other. So in other words, when you are writing in this period, what's the big thing that affects what kind of linguistic choices you make? It seems to be fiction versus non-fiction. We're just starting to kind of investigate what that might be. But one of the things about the techniques we use, the principal components analysis we use, you can now start to drill down and see what linguistic features are patterning where. So what is it that's pushing fictional texts over here? And it tends to be pronouns. So use of first and second person pronouns is pushing those over there. And maybe not surprisingly, you get much fewer pronouns being used, or fewer first and second person pronouns being used in fiction and non-fiction. The other thing, our computer scientist friends who work on the project are constantly, they don't really trust principal component analysis. They think we're counting too much stuff, so they're constantly trying to undermine what we've done. And one of the things our computer scientist friends said to us was, well, yeah, okay, you've counted 100 linguistic features and you're getting this variation. What if these linguistic features are very complex things that were worked out in Carnegie Mellon, and they spent ages trying to put all of the linguistic features into higher level categories to come up with the things that we count. What if we just count words? What if can we produce a picture of variation if we just count most frequent words in these texts? And the answer is yes, you can. And they triumphantly said to us, in fact, if all you're trying to do is distinguish fiction and non-fiction in the way that you've done here, you only need to count the word the. And that produces the same kind of spread. And again, so you get higher levels of the in non-fictional writing and lower levels in fiction. Which now that I say it to you, kind of makes sense, because you're talking about things here, and you're giving information, and suddenly you get very high usage of the. And over here, people are talking to each other, and they're using lower frequencies. So we're kind of finding all kinds of interesting stuff out about text, and even though we've been throwing all this very high level statistics at this stuff, but it does actually look as though you can find out almost everything you need to know just by counting the word the in text. But it's worth knowing. Okay, so that's kind of high level stuff, and by the way, there's another kind of axis of variation, which seems to be subjectivity versus objectivity. So you can see that drama is much more subjective than elegy, for example. So some texts, so there's also a kind of up-down variation, but that's not as clearly evidenced as the fiction, non-fiction. That's one of the things we're going to be looking into in more detail as we carry on, and as I fix that graph. Okay, so now I'm going to shift gears and start talking about individual words rather than thousands of texts. And one of the kind of interesting, really fun things about doing this project for me has been working with computer scientists, because of the way they think differently to literary people like me. And that example of counting the word the is kind of a good example. And computer scientists kind of like parsing, and they like things to be like, well, let's just do it simply. Let's just count the interest. They kind of be really easy stuff. So we've been playing around with very complex things. And Mike Gleischer, who's the professor of data visualization and computer science at Madison, Wisconsin University, was kind of playing around with actually our drama corpus, and he was doing that very computer sciencey thing of saying, okay, if I want to pull all of the Shakespeare plays out of this drama corpus, what's the smallest amount of information that I need in order to be able to do that? And by that he was thinking, okay, what words, if I find them in a text, will tell me that it's a Shakespeare text? So what's the smallest number of, what are the least number of words, or what are the words that are most characteristic of Shakespeare? In other words, you think we have in our drama, and the drama corpus he was using, we have 554 plays. So his question was, okay, what are the words where, if I find that word in one of those 554 texts, I will either know for sure it's Shakespeare, or I'll have a very good chance of being right that it's Shakespeare. Now, when he explained it to me, I was thinking, well, I know them by Shakespeare. Why do you need to do this? But it's a kind of thought experiment. And as we'll see, it produces kind of interesting results. This is the kind of email that Mike sent me one day. Really, the only two columns you need to worry about are these two columns here. The first one is the number of Shakespeare texts that the word appears in. The number of files which we say are by Shakespeare that word appears in. The second number is the total number of texts that the word appears in. So, in other words, this hoa for hello appears in 26 Shakespeare texts and only appears in 39 texts altogether in the 554 that we have. So in other words, this is a really, really characteristic Shakespeare word. And not only is it characteristic of Shakespeare, it's not characteristic of anyone else. So it's not just that it's a really good marker of Shakespeare, it's that it's also not in other people. So Mike got very excited with that. I'm not so excited by hoa, although it kind of is interesting. The one that really jumped out at me is Sequent, which appears in 7 Shakespeare texts and only 7 Shakespeare texts. In other words, no other dramatist in the early modern period uses the word sequent. Shakespeare uses it 7 times, but no other early modern dramatist uses that word. Now this, you can see there are lots of others quite interesting ones there, but sequent is the one that really jumped out at me. And it jumped out at me because it's Latinate, and Shakespeare does not like Latinate words. Other dramatists use far higher rates of Latinate words than Shakespeare. Generally, very often in Shakespeare, the characters, we think of the characters in Shakespeare who use Latinate words. They're almost always satirized. They're almost always being laughed at for being pretentious. And that seems to be Shakespeare's personal point of view. I mean, Spevak in the introduction to his Concordance says that Shakespeare uses about 50% fewer Latinate terms than other writers from the time. Irritatingly, doesn't supply any evidence for that. Doesn't say where he got those figures from or when he wrote back. I quoted that a lot because it's such a useful quotation, but he doesn't give any kind of detailed breakdown. But I think it's true. I think it's so Shakespeare does not seem to like Latinate words, and yet somehow, some reason, sequent is one of his pet words. He loves that word. He really, really loves it, and nobody else does. So, what can we do with this? Well, in the past, nothing really. We wouldn't have been able to do. We just say, well, Shakespeare really likes the word sequent. But now, because of EBO TCP, we can now say, oh, well, in a drama, it's only appearing in Shakespeare. Where's he getting that word from? Where does he get it from? He's clearly not getting it from any of his fellow dramatists, because they're not using it. But now that we've got EBO TCP, we've got 60,000 texts, virtually the whole of early modern print culture. We can now we could search those 60,000 texts. Now, I said earlier on, it's actually quite difficult. You could get all of them, get those texts, but they're quite difficult to use. Luckily, very nice people like Anupam Basu at Washington University in St. Louis has set up, I think this is the best early modern site for it. Absolutely fantastic. I use it all the time. It's effectively a front end to EBO TCP. It allows you to search all 60,000 texts. So So you can go into early modern print and you can search for a particular word and do all kinds of really fun things with it, which I'll show you in a moment. There's also EBO TCP is so important that lots of people are building stuff on the front end of it. Another site that does something very similar is JISC Historic Texts. Now, JISC is the UK kind of collaborative academic computing body which provides computing of infrastructure and also software for the whole academic community in the UK. And I'm really keen on JISC because one of the things they did was they went to the publisher who owns the copyright for EBO, for the actual page images that TCP is based on, and made them an offer and got all of the page images. And up until that point, universities were being charged huge amounts of money to access those page images. But JISC, because they went as a group and said, okay, we're every UK university, we want access to your page images, we'll give you this, and that'll be it. And for some reason, the publishers said yes. Unfortunately, to get into JISC historical texts, you need a login from a UK academic institution. But that's not an impossible thing to get.
You are still in Europe.
And I think it's a really great resource. One of the things about it is that JISC actually doesn't just include EBO TCP, it includes the British Library 19th century collections and 18th century collections. So you're actually searching over a bigger timeline when if you can get at JISC historical texts. You do a search for Sequent. Here's a search for Sequent. This is the kind of results you get. It gives you a kind of quite a crude indication of the frequency of that word over time. So here's the time that you're searching on. This is how many times the word is appearing. The great thing that JISC historic text does that early print doesn't is it takes you straight to the actual documents and the page images of the documents, so you can go straight through to see them. It has a kind of a few little foibles in terms of what you're actually searching. The two sites are you're actually searching slightly different versions of the text files, which have been modernized in different ways, which is actually a good thing because no modernization is perfect. In fact, they're all very imperfect. So searching two versions of the same text sometimes brings up words that one search doesn't find. Okay, so that's what JISC historic text does. Actually, early print does something very similar. This is a frequency graph for Sequent from early print. And again, you can see you've got the timeline, 1480 to 1700. You can see you get a big boost of Sequents in the kind of mid-17th century. These frequencies are all normalized against how many texts there are at each point. So in other words, if you run along from there to there are lots more Sequents here because there are a lot more texts at that period. So to get up to the same level, because it's normalized, you need to have a higher frequency. So this is early print. And the great things you can do with early print, if you click on there, remember early print's completely free, anyone can use it at any point. You get a keyword in context printout. So this is every instance of Sequent that early print has found, and actually there are about 4 or 5 pages of this that goes on. So you can, and one of the, and you can see it's highlighted, Sequent here. These blue numbers are the TCP file numbers. So each of these is a book. You've got a date, author, the title. So you can't get through to the actual text from early print because some of these texts are not licensed, are not freely available yet. You can on just historical text because they bought the license. So you can't get any further than this with early print. But if you're doing the kind of thing we're doing here, remember our question is, where does Shakespeare get the word sequent from? If you're doing the kind of thing that we're doing here, actually, I found it incredibly useful just to be able to see on one page or a series of pages the kinds of texts that a word is appearing in. So if you know anything about early modern literature, you can start to spot some of these names. You can tell from the title what's going on, and then you've also got the kind of keyword in context. You can see what kind of text there is. And I was about to say it's kind of interesting when you read down here, but it's not. It's incredibly boring. And the reason it's incredibly boring is sequent is used in, here's Thomas Stapleton's A Counterblast to Mr. Horne's vain ... And this is a whole series of kind of religious polemics where people are berating each other for being so stupid about whatever it is they're being stupid about. And what they're doing when Thomas Stapleton is producing this counterblast to Mr. Horne's vanity, these sequents are in quotations from the Bible or quotations from authorities. So he's basically giving him a list of references. So he's saying 353, Philip the Bow, the French King, 329, and sequent, and it's like etc., etc. So it's basically a way of saying, go to this page and then the other page is following. Or go to this point in the Bible and the other one. So it's a referencing tool. So it's like ibid or opsit or something like that. And actually almost everything on this page is that kind of use of sequent. Now, I don't know for certain, I can't prove it, but I don't think Shakespeare is reading really, really boring religious controversy. He's not interested in that kind of stuff. So, although these uses of sequent are the ones that, in numerical terms, are massively in the majority, I don't find that a convincing place for Shakespeare to have found the word and become enamoured of it in the way that he did. Now we get to another kind of value in suddenly having this amount of text. You end up finding out about text that you did not know existed. So I was reading through all of these thinking, this can't be where Shakespeare gets the sequent from. I mean, it's just... And you get down, you come down, blah, 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 blah. And then you get these two instances from 1585 by a guy called Christopher Auckland. Anyone heard of Christopher Auckland? I asked a room full of early modern specialists this, and none of them had either, so don't feel bad. But suddenly, if you look at, you probably can't see them, you'll see these instances in a moment. Suddenly they're not being used as etc., etc. Suddenly you've got as though in fight the sequent day, and in the sequent spring. So it's been used as an adjective to mean following. And that looks much more like how Shakespeare uses it. But what kind of text is this Christopher Auckland guy? Well, if you click, again, another good thing about early print, if you click on that blue number, it takes you to one of the main EBO TCP sites, which is where there's a kind of full bibliographical record for every text in TCP. And here we've got the bibliographical record for Christopher Auckland. The book is called The Valiant Acts and Victorious Battles of the English Nation. from the year of our Lord 1327, blah, 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 blah. It's basically a kind of patriotic poem about how great the English are. But there's something else actually. It's actually a translation. It's a translation. Christopher Auckland wrote it in Latin. And the actual translation, the use of the word sequent was actually by the translator, who's a guy called John Sharrock. The story of this text is that Christopher Auckland wrote this incredibly long, probably very boring Latin poem about how great the English are and how every battle they ever won, basically. And got it licensed to be taught in schools. Now, we don't know whether it ever actually was, but the book has a license where the Bishop of London basically says this book should be taught in every single school in the country. So if you were an Elizabethan schoolboy learning Latin, the chances are you had to plough your way through Christopher Auckland's victorious battles of the glorious English nation. But of course, everyone wants to crib. Nobody wants actually to deal with Christopher Auckland's probably appalling Latin. So John Sharrock translates it into English. So what we're actually dealing with here is a book which is, in its Latin version, is set potentially for every school child, every schoolboy in England, and then the translation of it. And of course, at this point, I'm starting to think, well, some people think Shakespeare was a teacher. So, if he was a teacher, there's quite a good chance he had to teach this book. I can't prove it. There's no way to be certain. But there we go. I think this is a more likely source for that word than Shakespeare ploughing through 60 volumes of very boring Protestants arguing about eternal damnation. So we've now kind of we've got a likely word, we've got a likely book. Here are if we want to actually see the kind of context it appears in, we go back to just historic texts. These are the two instances of sequent in the translation of Auckland's poem. Here they are, it's a black letter text as well. So, if you have, here's the word, sequent. He to the Almighty King, his wife and children does commend, as though in fight the sequent day should bring his fatal end. He put his gold away in hope that on the morrow morn he shall the Frenchman's gain, as custom was of old before. So this king putting all his gold away because he's going to get some more when he beats the French tomorrow. And here we've got the sequent day. And the second one, it comes much later. And here is this is actually the English beating the Scottish. The brutes by force of conquering hand, that only to intend, and in the sequent spring, the surging floods with navy vast, quite covered for to be, and troops of horsemen flocking fast, to enter Scottish lands, proposing this that only stay, the Scottish heir from mother's lap, by force to take away. So here's a possible source for the word sequent in Shakespeare. So now we're going to move away from the high level digital stuff, and let's have a look, because now I'm still really interested in this word, and now I'm going to become a kind of very traditional philologist and just look at, here are the instances of sequent in Shakespeare. Okay, so we know that this word is really, really important to him. He really likes this word. These are all of the instances in Shakespeare of the word. And you'll notice that there are actually 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. And remember we had 7 and 7, but that's because our those are instances in documents rather than, so how many, there are 7 documents in TCP that have the word sequent in. Some of them might have it more than once, which is why there's a mismatch between the numbers. But this is every use. In other words, so Shakespeare likes the word more than we thought. He's actually used it 9 times. And here are the uses. And the first usage, which is the one that I actually knew, because I used this as an example in my Shakespeare grammar, not of sequent, but of this kind of double possessive, a follower of the stranger queens. This comes from Love's Live as Lost, and it comes from what the character Armado is talking. Is it Armado? Yeah, it's Armado. And Armado is one of these characters that Shakespeare satirizes for being very pompous and for being in love with pretentious Latinate language. So in other words, the first time Shakespeare uses sequent, he uses it in a satirical. The character is supposed to be ridiculous. So when Shakespeare first uses this word, he's making fun of it. He's not using it as a normal word. You're supposed to laugh at that. You're supposed to find it ridiculous. Because a sequent, he's just taken it from Latin. Why doesn't he just say follower? Why doesn't he just say friend? But then something weird happens. If you look at the next usages, the following usages are all just straightforward. And what to this was sequent, thou knowest already. What followed after this, you already know. My sequent present protestation, a dozen sequent messengers, sequent death, is very sequent to your whipping, that sequent issue, scourged by the sequent. In sequent toil, I've put this instant from the sonnets, by the way, I've put 1609, but I put a question mark after it because that's the date of the publication of the sonnets, but they were almost certainly written earlier. So that in terms of writing, it's probably somewhere in here, but we don't know where. But look at the dates. Shakespeare first uses it in 1594. He doesn't use it again for about 6 years. When he starts using it again, it doesn't have any of the sense of satire that it did right at the start. So it's almost like the word has kind of changed in his head. It's changed from one that was a ridiculous word that only an idiot would use, just to a kind of normal word that he just uses. But look at how intense his use of it is once he starts using it. I'm not 1600, but then 1602, 1603, 1603, 1604, 1604, 1605, and probably a bit earlier. He doesn't write anything in that period, he doesn't write a single play in that period without using the word sequent. And then he stops. And he never uses it again. So, and I get really excited by this. Because I think you can see Shakespeare, how Shakespeare is using words. He picks up this weird word, uses it satirically, but then actually, no, I quite like it. It's not a ridiculous word at all, it's quite nice. And he has this real kind of intense love affair with this word. Never uses it, but then breaks off. Never uses it again. And that's it. And to me, I like this because this is back to what I was doing when I was a PhD student. Just looking at individual words like a proper literary person. But how we got here was by having 60,000 texts digitally available that we could search for stuff and see this word moving through text. And see it initially in those boring kind of Protestant polemical texts where they can't believe Shakespeare even read this, and even if he had, I don't think he'd have picked up the word sequent. But then we can see it starting to come through in something like Upland or John Shorrock's version of Upland. So to see it moving from one place one type of text into another and then potentially being picked up by Shakespeare. So instead of worrying too much about Shakespeare, now we're thinking about how this word moves through early modern culture. And that's one of the things that I'm becoming more and more interested in doing as these tools become available. These are links to the tools that I've talked about. I can give you the slides so that you can distribute these if you want. I hope that was interesting. There are lots of other things that you can do with these things, and as I said, the Visualizing English print site operates as a tagger, and if you've got any kind of tagging tasks that you want to do, it will help you, and you don't just need to be an early modern specialist. But thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much for this great talk. In the first part of your talk, you mentioned the word "the," which is enough to distinguish fiction or fiction to some extent. The very same word "the" is fairly enough to tell apart men and women. If we believe James Pennebaker, the same word "the" is enough to distinguish from the Irish and the American varieties of English. So the most frequent word in your language is quite a good discriminator to tell apart many different things. So I think that a few Sequent questions will follow right now.
I'm trying to distinguish between two aspects. One thing is that you started talking about Sequent as a word which is specific to Shakespeare, but and it would allow to discriminate between his text and other texts. But I'm not sure that you can make a strong claim about that, because as you know from other research in stylometry, a word alone is very difficult to use. So hapax legomena, especially, or very seldom used words, they are problematic in discriminating. So usually it's far better to use some of, as you all know about that. So we don't have to go down this road, but is it interesting to look at the words only because it's typical for Shakespeare in contrast to contemporaries? Or is it more interesting to say, can we see love affairs with words? So it's more or less a fashion. And you could contrast Shakespeare's use of the word to the contemporary use, not in place, but in general, and beyond Auckland, because we saw that the curve was going up. And do we need this as a choice mechanism? Wouldn't it be just saying we could use a choice mechanism for the interesting words? Do we see very short periods of intensive use of words, and then before and after they drop? So that would be. So obviously we have a fashion of using words. So we don't need this discriminating function to see something interesting here.
Yeah, no, that's a really good point. I mean, I think, the low frequency words, it's very problematic to make statistical deductions on them, because they're low frequency, the variation, you might have, if one play hasn't survived, that might have used the word sequent. I mean, But to me, the interesting thing is that Shakespeare uses it so much, and none of the other playwrights do. So it's not just that he uses it a lot, but it's that other people don't. At least other playwrights don't. And a couple of the words I'm going to talk about tomorrow, in words that people have claimed that Shakespeare invented, which actually he didn't invent, they behave in a very different way. So what you get is you find that those words suddenly appear in about 3 or 4 playwrights at the same time. So it's like they're all down the cog saying, "Hey, you heard this word?" and then they all use it. So, and that's kind of like, I think, what you were saying about those words being popular. So you do get words that behave like that, and you can, again, using things like early print, you can see that happening. you can see that, so, the OED is, the OED gives Shakespeare as the first user, but actually he's not. And there's about 4 instances all around the same date of him, Johnson, Chapman, all using Grant is a good one, and Zaney is another one. That happens with. So you do get words where other playwrights, it's kind of everyone's using it, but Sequent you don't. So that's kind of why I want to treat that one slightly different. But yeah, I wouldn't, I would never want to say, okay, if a play if an anonymous play has the word Sequent in it, it must be Shakespeare. I kind of would want to say it, but no, I mean that would not be evidence for it.
But if you had a big number of those low frequency words, then perhaps, and they would all be behaving like Sequent, then that would be basically doing zeta or iota in Barosian terms.
Yeah, I mean, I kind of don't want to use these as attribution tools.
Absolutely, yeah.
Because I actually think it's more interesting to see, to separate the word from the person and say, actually the interesting thing is how that word got there.
Yeah.
Where did Shakespeare get it from? And how does it move through early modern culture? And now we're in a position to be able to do that.
So have you tried the Sequent thing on traditional Shakespeare scholars?
Kind of.
What happened?
Well, I did it in Italy at a conference, and they bought it.
What about the blasphemous statement about Shakespeare not creating all those words?
So I did that in Oxford, not so long ago. And well, it was a mixed audience, so it was the Philological Society. And the kind of linguists, said, yeah, of course. And then the literary people going, because literary people love the idea that Shakespeare invented words because it proves how good he was. But unfortunately, he didn't. But he's still good.
In a way, this reminds the situation that we had in Poland with the great writer, great poet Jan Arnowski, who was actually like 40 years before Shakespeare, who was claimed to have invented many words, which is not true. When you just chase those words, you sooner or later discover that they were not invented by the guy. So, but anyway, he did invent the literary language of Polish, right?
And I think the mechanism of the same misunderstanding was exactly what you told me. I think that was over Pyrrhovian beer, that the fault is the Oxford Dictionary, which simply quotes as first used Shakespeare because everybody knows him. And I think that the same thing goes for Polish lexicons because Kochanowski is legal.
Yeah, so I'll talk about this a bit more tomorrow, but the Oxford English Dictionary gives examples for every word. And they very often have Shakespeare as the first example for a word. Now, actually, strictly speaking, if you read how they explain that, they're not trying to find the earliest use. They call it first citation. They don't call it first use. But literary scholars especially, and most people assume that that's the first instance that can be found. Right? It almost never is. And they weren't trying to do that. They were actually trying to find one that was a good example, or which came from a famous writer. So of course Shakespeare is the best
Also,
one.
it sort of makes sense that he did it, because if he did, of course there's a different conditional I should use anyway, well then whatever he wrote would like Finnegan's Wake. And I don't think that would, put Shakespeare in the right place.
Yeah.
Well, I would have a question about the sudden shift of the Shakespearean, or his perception of the word sequent, because there was this gap between the first use and the others. So, can you maybe say a little more about what perhaps might have happened that he started to perceive it as a serious word.
Yeah, I mean, of course, this is, it's entirely speculation. It's fun. So, I think my what I would say is, he reads or hears this word somewhere. He notices that it's a Latinate word and classes it as something ridiculous. But sometime in that gap, potentially 6-year gap, although this is Hamlet and the dates for starting to write Hamlet are not entirely clear. But sometime in that gap, having used it once as a kind of example of ridiculousness, it kind of gets naturalized. So he becomes used to it, and of course he loves words. And why throw a good word away? So I think he kind of uses it once, ridiculous, and then starts using it again. And actually he does that again. So there's in Henry IV Part 2, there's quite a long sequence where two characters actually discuss the word accommodated, which at the time was a new word. And they actually talk about the derivation and talk about how it comes from Latin. But it's clearly being used in a way. The character who uses it clearly doesn't understand the word, doesn't know what it means. He's just using it to try and be pretentious. So Shakespeare seems to be using that word as an example of a kind of pretentious word. But then accommodated then crops up again in King Lear, and it's being used entirely seriously. It's in one of the storm scenes, and being used as when Lear is thinking about poor unaccommodated wretch. So it's entirely serious. So there seems to, we take that as evidence for there's something going on in Shakespeare's head where he takes these, when the first time he comes across some of these words, he thinks, oh, that's kind of ridiculous, use it as satire. But then it becomes kind of naturalized within his vocabulary. I think you can see that with Sequent.
Sorry. What about this cement in first folio versus Sequent? Was it just a typo? What do you think about it?
Obviously, yeah, I think it's a typo. Presumably, so Hamlet. Hamlet textually really complex. Well, to me, Sequent makes more sense. And I suppose you can say it's what this was cement, as in what was coupled with this. But
It's interesting that it doesn't appear in the mud quarto.
it doesn't appear.
That it doesn't appear in the first quarto, which would sort of indirectly say that this is Shakespeare's word, rather than the word of any of the pirates.
Yeah, I think the actual section it appears in doesn't appear though. It's not like it gets revised out. I think it's the sections missing.
Could you show again the critic where we saw the Sequent in the context of the other words? So, how many hits do you have? I mean, one way to look at it would be to kind of filter out all the uses where it means and the following, and try to look at the rest of the list.
So I'll just rerun the. So just while we're waiting, you can actually, one of the good things about early print you can use wildcards, and you can use regex, and it also has the version of TCP that's searching has been tagged for part of speech, so you can also search nouns, things like that. Okay, so Okay, so 365 documents, 4 pages like that basically.
And how many instances out of those are before actually Shakespeare had used?
So we're up to 1567. So that page 1 goes up to. Okay, so it's probably. Okay, so if we're going to put the cut-off date as 1598, then we're about to here. So it's the first page that comes before Shakespeare. So it's something that's going on before then. As far as early prints goes, anyway, this is the sample of printed texts that was available to Shakespeare for him to come across that with. Although of course it could have been in manuscript. You might have heard it, or it doesn't look like a very spoken word to me.
But you could get a hint if you filter that. The other mentions how to get a hint if there was a general tendency to use the word at that time, even if the other playwrights were avoiding it. So to make it either you get really a very personal love affair out of that, because no one else was using it, or you see that he was pulling in words from other areas of using.
Yeah. And also, I mean, you can see, these religious controversy guys. So here's Thomas Stapleton. All of those uses from the same text. And it's one of the good things about the keyword in context printer. You can see that this word is really concentrated in a certain kind of text, and the people who are using it in those texts are using it a lot.
But it seems to be in the footnotes actually. So
Sorry?
the word seems to be used in the footnotes.
Yeah.
And so who looks into the footnotes? So you're not reading that. I think I just wanted to say maybe just take me this quick list and then filter out all these obvious uses in footnotes and looking at the rest of the distribution, and then compare that to Shakespeare's usage, and then see whether you can find.
You wouldn't have very many. There's a reason that Auckland usage just jumped out at me, because they're just about the only ones. So there's a non. John Bartlett. Well, there really are not very many that aren't coming in that kind of big sense.
Any other questions?
Yeah, thank you very much again. Thank you.